maybe one of the biggest, boldest claims that we hear in the AI space is that AI poses an existential threat to humanity, that it's going to wipe out humanity or at least cause massive, massive harm. A lot of people, myself included, are inclined to dismiss these kinds of claims as being a bit too fanciful, too ridiculous, supposing that the AI has more power than it actually does or will have. But there are some people who take the arguments quite seriously. Today I talked to Risto. He's the head of EU policy and research at the Future of Life Institute, and Torben Swoboda, who's the doctoral researcher at the Institute of Philosophy at KU Leuven. And they've written a paper recently in which they identify 3 of the main arguments for dismissing concerns about the existential risk of AI. So let me just talk about what those 3 arguments are very quickly, and then in our conversation, you'll hear them really spell them out. The first argument that people think for why we should not pay attention to claims about the existential risk of AI is called the distraction argument. The basic idea is that, look, there are tons of risks of AI right here and now today: privacy violations, biased AI, black box AI, that sort of thing. And we need to pay attention to those things. And talking about these sort of far off existential risks, that's just a distraction, and it's a draining of resources away from the problems that really need solving, the ones that are here today. So that's the first argument that they discuss, and they think it's misguided, but that's one that they find in the general media. The second argument that they encounter is one that sort of goes like this. It says, look, don't worry about the existential risk of AI. If that ever happens, and it probably never will, it's a long way off, and we have plenty of checkpoints along the way. Right? There's going to be milestones that we hit towards getting to AI that can destroy us all, and since there's lots of checkpoints, no need to get all worked up about it now. That's the second argument that they handle. And then the third argument that they deal with is to say, oh, all you people who think that AI is going to destroy the world, you're looking at the wrong place. What you should be looking at is humans. It's human frailty. It's not the tool, it's the kinds of beings, people, that are wielding the tool that create the real problem. So those are the 3 arguments that Risto and Torben find in sort of popular media for why we can dismiss claims about the existential risks of AI. And they find each one of those arguments wanting. So in short, they're really saying, look, we should take these claims about existential risk seriously, and we should devote at least some resources to considering them. Okay, that's what this episode is about. If you like this and you're one of the many people who are listening on a mobile browser, please go over to Apple or Spotify and subscribe so you can get new episodes. If you like this content, you might also like my book, also called Ethical Machines. That's on Amazon and all the other places. And then I do a lot of writing on Substack as well. That's at readblackman.substack.com. And finally, if there's anything you want me to talk about, you find particularly interesting, you have trenchant criticism to offer, you can email me at em@readblackman.com. All right, that's it for me. Let's go talk to Risto and Torben. Part and parcel of criticizing AI hype is that people think that we should stop talking about existential risks of AI, so-called existential risks. And as I understand it, you think that there are at least 3 main arguments for why we should just get over the existential risk stuff and move on to, if you like, the more mundane risks of bias and discrimination and privacy violations and that sort of thing. And you think, no, that's too quick. And the arguments for why we should move on from existential risk are misguided. Do I have that right?
Yeah, maybe I'll give very quick context. We wrote a paper together with lots of academics that basically tried to see from popular media what kinds of arguments are spoken about, are shared in op-eds and places like that discuss why existential risk from AI should not be the focus. And we found that 3 arguments seem to be the most prominent based on those op-eds.
All right, so let's go, give me one of them. Let's start with just one argument. What's one of the big arguments against being concerned about existential risk?
Yeah, the first argument we found was what we call the distraction argument. So this argument claims that focusing on hypothetical future existential risk from AI, it distracts attention away from present actual risks that matter, addressing those. And this argument basically makes the case that those doomsday scenarios, which is a term that oftentimes is used related to that, they actually primarily benefit tech companies, give more attention to them. They can direct regulatory conversations more away from actually addressing harms, the current harms. And talking about, hey, maybe there are some future harms. We don't really know how to address them. We don't really know, how to talk about them. And issues like algorithmic bias, privacy, misinformation, those kinds of things, they are thrown aside and really are not focused on.
And now why, and you think that argument is misguided? Why is that? I suspect I'm sympathetic, but why do you think it's misguided?
Yeah, and we don't find this argument fully satisfying. Of course, there are nuances that we can get into, but for example, the idea that this discourse increases hype and investment, it's not necessary for this discourse to overclaim AI capabilities or AI abilities. It can also, for example, some stakeholders, some researchers, some academics are claiming that actually there are some AI systems that don't need to be as capable as AGI that could potentially pose very serious risks. So you don't need to overhype the capabilities, which would make companies, countries, nation states be very interested in developing and putting more investments into it. It can actually be the case that we already have quite capable AI systems that can pose those risks without having AGI or needing to achieve AGI.
Sure.
That's one response. Another response is that we don't really know that the existential risk discourse itself has had the impact that, for example, a lot of companies and a lot of countries have started to invest more into general purpose AI systems like ChatGPT and these ones. It could be because, firstly, general purpose AI systems were starting to be developed and deployed more, and that actually amplified the concerns that people had. That's much more plausible. That's happened rather than the existential risk concern made others invest into AI. That doesn't seem very plausible. It seems more plausible that more investment started developing and deploying these systems, and that made people concerned. That's much more plausible as a causal effect. So that's another one.
There's something weird about the claim that we shouldn't talk about it or something along those lines. What do you mean we? And you don't have to. Is the claim something like each individual who engages in such conversation is engaging in something that's ethically problematic? That seems insane to me. So you're never allowed to discuss, it's ethically permissible to discuss unlikely scenarios or something along those lines? What's the general ethical principle? It's ethically wrong to discuss existential risks? That can't be the case. It's generally wrong to discuss existential risks with a low probability? That can't be. It's ethically wrong to discuss X at all. Usually seems like a pretty shitty principle insofar as you think that there's a value in free inquiries. So even if we grant the claim, I feel like you could grant them the empirical claim. Yeah, you know what? Attention, et cetera, is a limited resource. And insofar as some people spend their time talking about the existential risks as opposed to the risks that are here today, they are, in fact, not using resources towards, if you like, in some broad sense, a societal higher priority at the moment, at least in the short term. Okay, let's say that I'll even grant you it's bad. It still doesn't mean that they're ethically required to stop it. But I also think it's not bad. It's perfectly acceptable. There's just a weird, what's the scope or who's supposed to be subject to this obligation to shut up about existential risk?
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry. I think it's part of the discussion or the unclarity of this argument is to whom it's directed at. Is it about policymakers? Is it about journalists? Is it about researchers?
Right.
And
exactly.
So if you take the frame of activism and we want more resources geared towards AI ethics, for example. So let's stop talking about existential risk. Many researchers are actually employed by private corporations who are investigating AI safety issues. So if you now take it seriously, let's stop this kind of research into existential risk. I don't really see that these corporations will now swift their resources towards AI ethics.
Right.
So it just means less overall in this direction.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's more plausible if we talk about policymakers, for example, right? If policymakers, if they only focus on existential risk because that risk is so immense, so severe, and we neglect all the current issues, they absolutely do have a point here. But I think the response to this argument is not necessarily let's stop talking completely about existential risk, but rather we might also say, hey, maybe there is definitely value in addressing current harms, more AI ethics harms. But we also need to discuss the existential risk. And maybe we should increase resources altogether in this area.
That makes it sound that they're arguing against a straw man. If the claim is something like, we should never, policymakers, let's make it as strong as we can to your point. If there is someone who we don't want to get really distracted, it's probably policymakers. They've got limited things that they can talk about and pass policy against, et cetera, put political capital behind. Nobody thinks, I don't think, that no one reasonable thinks those policymakers should only ever talk about existential risk. Nobody thinks that. That's insane. The alternative is then they should think some, but not solely, which most people I think would get behind. And then the third option is they should never talk about existential risk, and they should only talk about, but that seems a bit too narrow, too binding, too short-sighted, or something along those lines. You think that policymakers should also think about what's going on 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Not that they're going to necessarily do anything right now, but because you have to be, to some extent, proactive about these kinds of things. Who are they arguing against?
The question is also who's they, because there are different people, and some people are saying they are making not this extreme case of let's never talk about this topic, but they are saying we are talking too much about it. Could be less, and we should focus more on what's going on right now. So this is part of the problem, right? Like we try to reconstruct arguments, and we find people who make similar claims, and then we put this together. And within that group, you will have lots of different opinions. And within the group of like people who are concerned about catastrophic or existential risk, it's not just black and white. You will have people who are concerned about the long-term future. Other people are concerned about what's happening within the next 1-2 years. Some people are concerned about a superintelligence scenario. Right. Other people are concerned about misuse and accidents and biochemical context, for example.
Yeah, I guess the most plausible version, as Torben also highlighted, is many of these proponents right now think that there is too much conversation about existential risk. So maybe they wouldn't say there should be no conversation. Maybe they wouldn't say that we should have all of the conversation on existential risk, but they think that currently the balance is not correct. It's too much is spoken of it. And we also evaluate this claim to some extent. And this idea that over the last, let's say, couple of years, existential risk focus has become so massive that all of the other issues are thrown aside. Yeah. And we try to see whether this makes sense. And for example, we found one analysis that assessed various kind of changes in the field, whether they would show whether AI ethics issues get more attention now or existential risk. And one proxy that they used was like, how much do people search online on Google, for example, different keywords? And for example, I think like 2023, in the middle of that or so, we could see that there was a trend upwards on existential risk. People search for existential risk from AI more. But they also at the same time started searching for discrimination from AI more. So that also went up. So that indicates that both concerns were heightened at that time. Then also you can take a look at, since we're talking about policymakers a lot, take a look at how much do policymakers focus on different issues. And there's really very little attention to catastrophic risk or existential risk from AI. Like most policy documents don't focus on those. Most policy documents focus on mainstream present issues that are more visible, more clear for stakeholders. There are also examples of where policymakers actually have rejected any bill that has some relevance to catastrophic risk. For example, in California, there was at the end of last year, Governor Newsom, he explicitly rejected a proposal that was about the catastrophic risk from AI, whereas he accepted the bills that were about deep fakes, for example, and some other ones. So that's like clear indication that actually it looks like those types of bills, even when they have been introduced, and very rarely, that's basically the only example of a bill being introduced that is directly about catastrophic risk. Other things have been around forums and summits and discussions at a global level around these topics, like the UK AI Safety Summit, places like that. But those are not actual policy documents. They're like voluntary guidelines and conversations to be had. And it's quite reasonable for global conversations to be about global issues. So for example, climate change discussions, they focus on climate change, global climate change, rather than like local pollution issues. And that's quite reasonable because they're international summits. So they should be focusing on these issues, and local issues should be focused on like in other avenues. but those are rare examples. So empirically, we don't really find that those conversations are happening more, or those policy attention is being diverted.
Maybe to
Let me ask you one more question on this, and then let's move on to the next argument. What do you make of this claim that this focus serves the interests of the tech oligarchs? It serves the interests of Zuckerberg or Musk or Bezos or Sam Altman, of course, Microsoft, Google, because the White House, this was under Biden, right? They called these tech giants to the White House to talk about the risks of AI. And so is there a plausible empirical claim that a media focus on existential risk of AI serves the interests of those tech leaders?
Yeah, I think in general, we should be wary about industry leaders because they definitely have their own motives, and in particular to grow their own business. And some of these safety or existential risk arguments can definitely be abused to that kind of end. So, for instance, you might say, hey, AI is such a dangerous technology, so it should not be widely accessible. But don't worry, we are the people who are responsible and we will do it in a safe way. So, what we need are regulatory burdens so that other people cannot enter this market. And then you only have Microsoft, OpenAI, Anthropic who are developing this technology.
Sure.
And so we should definitely be wary about industry leaders and what their motives are. Absolutely. But it doesn't neglect the point that there might be valid concerns and also valid arguments for certain kinds of policies that increase regulatory burdens on others.
To add to that, we can, I think, by looking at what is the corporation or corporate behavior regarding different AI risks and different discourses, we can also get some inclinations of how these different discourses are having an impact on the behavior of companies. So, for example, OpenAI has recently been in media regarding whistleblower incidents and different experts coming out saying that, hey, like there is some behavior at OpenAI that they don't feel comfortable about, and so on and so forth. And for example, OpenAI used very restrictive agreements with a lot of people, a lot of researchers, so that they couldn't freely speak. And they couldn't freely speak about any kind of risk, whether it's like short-term risk or long-term risk or existential risk or narrow risk or whatever type of risk. They couldn't speak about any of those. That indicates that it's not in the corporation interest to have them go and speak about whatever the risk is. If it was the case that they didn't care about the existential risk part, or they even actually wanted that to be spoken about because that was somehow benefiting them, they would not have that kind of blanket policy around whistleblowing generally. Like that's one indication. I also added like a theoretical level. It's quite plausible that this kind of 4D chess movement from corporations to amplify existential risk discourse to benefit themselves is truly 4D chess, because they are alerting people to be more afraid of AI systems. Even though you're talking about potentially future risks, like you are making people more scared about AI. For sure, the implication, a very plausible scenario, is that they want to regulate AI more now, not only in the future. So you are actually sensitizing people more toward the risks. So it's quite plausible and quite reasonable for you to expect that strategy is not very reasonable. It can backfire very easily. So that kind of 4D just, I don't think is expected. Of course, there could be indirect effects of this actually benefiting companies, but at least it's unreasonable to think that's an explicit strategy because it can backfire so easily.
Yeah. It makes me think that it's harder for me to see how it benefits them financially. I could see how it would benefit them if you like egoistically, because now they're the center of attention, talking about these big important risks and they're the saviors of humanity. So it's gross, but it's not obviously in their sort of financial interest. Okay, let's move on to the next argument. So we'll put that one to the side. What's the second of three arguments for why we shouldn't take existential risk seriously?
Yeah, second argument is what we call the checkpoints for intervention argument. And basically, it says we don't face existential risk right now. And before we have AI that does pose existential risk, there will be a number of checkpoints that we will go through And at each of these checkpoints, we can make decisions to prohibit this kind of existential threat from emerging in the first place.
Okay, so the basic argument is something like, yeah, maybe that's legit, but not yet.
Yeah.
So let's wait to see how things unfold. And as things unfold, then we can revisit the situation. But right now, it's too minimal. The probability is too small for us to take it seriously at this point, unless you're like high in your college dorm room. That's where we are right now. And it doesn't elevate beyond that as of yet. So that's.
And I think like many people who are concerned about these existential risks, they will agree right now we are not at that point. But there will be, I think, more disagreement about which checkpoints are going to be valid or where do we where should we intervene? And I think there's probably more pessimism on the existential risk group, how likely it is that we make the right calls at these stages. So one of the checkpoints that was suggested was even a superintelligence, so that is an artificial intelligence system that is vastly superior to humans in cognitive intelligent domains, cannot just go out and wipe out humanity because it still relies on humans for certain inputs like chips and data and so on. But if you have a superintelligence, then by definition, that system would be really good at persuading humans and manipulating them. So how would you defeat that kind of system? It's by definition, the question is, how do we get there? Is that plausible and so on? I agree that more needs to be said on that aspect. But if you agree that you have such a system, then it seems really difficult how you would defeat it, because by definition, it's just better than you at reaching its goals.
Okay, so maybe this is going to depend on how we spell out this argument, but I take it the argument is something like, one, there's an empirical claim, which is something like, it's going to be a while. It's going to be a while before we get to a place where you have, if ever, it's going to be a while if ever we get to a place where we're going to have artificial superintelligence or something along those lines. So that's one empirical claim. The second empirical claim is that along the way towards that, down that very long path, there'll be places of intervention. Thus, in the interest of not waste, and something like premise 3, we shouldn't waste our time on phenomenally distant possibilities, especially when we have plenty more opportunities to deal with them, should the probability increase. So don't waste your time with us now. I take it that your response has to be something like those empirical claims. There's a sort of claim about you shouldn't waste your time, blah, blah, blah. And then we go about, let's not waste my time, I enjoy it, but let's put that to the side. I think that the best place for you to push, tell me if I'm wrong, is the empirical claim that we've got plenty of time. And I take it that one of the points is going to be something like, if you're like a Sam Altman or a Dario, what's his name? CEO of Anthropic. Yeah. You're going to say, we already got PhD level intelligence, bullshit, but okay. And soon we're going to have super PhD and super PhD and blah, blah, blah. So one claim is one thing to do is just deny the empirical claim that the road is that long. Is that the main source of your objection?
I think there's great uncertainty about the trajectory of AI development.
Yeah.
So I think Joshua Bengio says something like, okay, it could be 2 years, it could be 2 decades. I don't know. And I agree, it's really difficult. Like, you do definitely have people who believe that within 2 to 5 years, this seems plausible. At the very least, it doesn't even have to be super intelligence, but just something like human level AGI, which would be sufficient for many scenarios of extinction risk. And given this uncertainty of experts, and given that over the last couple of years, we have had quite a bit of acceleration or like of major breakthroughs, I would call them, right? Like something like ChatGPT, multimodality, LLMs. Now we are heading towards LLM-based agents. And part of the problem is ChatGPT was released overnight. There was no broader societal discussion about it. And then universities across the world had to scramble for new guidelines. How do we deal with students? They're never going to write their own essays again. So the next step is going to be LLM-based agents. Once they are released, what kind of havoc are they going to cause?
Yeah. Let me try to take their side. It's interesting, like, you shouldn't waste your time. What if I said something like this? We shouldn't devote significant resources, and then we can argue about what constitutes a significant resource, but whatever. We shouldn't devote significant resources to a potentially bad outcome if that potentially bad outcome is sufficiently far away. And there's plenty of time to prepare for it, even if we prepare later, start preparation later. And that seems plausible as a sort of general line of thought, as a sort of general principle. And then we're going to start arguing about how long the path is. But I don't know. Suppose I say, Yeah, you're right. Schools weren't prepared for AI written essays. And now grading is really difficult and sort of education is upside down a little bit. But that's not an existential risk. That's an immediate risk. In fact, that just brings out the further point that we need to pay attention to the risks that are right here, right now. There doesn't seem to be, one might say, a tremendous amount of evidence for thinking that the probability of existential risk has increased from, say, ChatGPT 3.5 to multimodal ChatGPT 4.0 or whatever the hell we're on now, or the latest Claude, Sonnet, blah, blah, blah. So I don't think the existential risk has changed since then.
Yeah, well, one could make that point perhaps, but I think our response to that is what exactly is the thing that we will all agree on that when we see that now there is existential risk and now we should actually stop it. So what exactly is that thing?
Yeah,
so
what
for
are the
example,
trigger points? Sure.
Yeah, what is the trigger point? Suppose I'm like a scientist in 1970, I'm talking about climate change, speeding up. Climate change is a thing that will be much worse in the future. And like people are like, yeah, let's wait. Right now, it's not too bad. And then it continues, and people start talking about how it's becoming worse. And others are like, hey, I don't think it's that bad yet. And like it's really
Right.
like it takes a lot of resources,
Yeah,
and they're not able to intervene because some don't agree, some do agree, and yeah.
Right. This is the frog boiling, right? The frog stays in the pot of water, right, until water's boiling because the temperature increases is so minuscule that the frog doesn't notice it. And so I take it your argument is something like that, like the societal water is coming to a boil as a result of AI, and there's no single point at which, oh, this is the trigger point. This is when we should get the hell out of the water, or something like that. Or the climate change analogy is also a good one. There's not the point at which we should start it. It's plausible. It's blah, blah, blah. We should get cracking. I wonder how much of the argument by your opposition is funded by the thought that it's all bullshit, that we're never going to get there, that Yoshua Bengio could say 5 years or 20 years, more like maybe 200 years. And if you think that, then I think, and now we're in the realm of uncertainty, to your point, Torben, right? It could be 200 years. And if it's 200 years, I don't think we should start planning for that now. Any risk mitigations that we could possibly implement right now are going to be defunct in 200 years anyway. So there'd be no point in doing it. So I think a lot hinges on when you think this is going to happen. So if you think, the two of you think, it's 10 years, 20 years, that's plausible. In the way that climate change, 10 years, 20 years, that was plausible. Then I can see your point. But if it's more, could be 200 years, could be 1,000 years. Could never happen because maybe the technology hits a wall and then we don't get past that wall forever because climate change kills us all. Anyway, yeah, so I guess I think, is that right? This is going to hinge on what you think the timeline looks like?
So this reminds me of the computer scientist Andrew Ng, who I think is famous for some quotes around worrying about, I can't remember exactly the quote, I have to paraphrase, but worrying about kind of AGI and AI takeover is like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. Like it's remote and so far away that it doesn't make sense to worry about that. Let's worry about it when it actually becomes a bigger deal. That relates to this objection that you make. I think, first of all, we have to go back to what Torben just said about different forecasts, different predictions, like Bengio and others. We should be humble about technological progress. It is not entirely implausible that AI could improve extremely fast. And we're seeing right now unprecedented advancement. So it's not completely implausible. Like I've been testing O3 model and like type of capabilities that it has impressed me a lot. And it changed quite a bit from 2 years ago. And it is having potentially quite unprecedented changes and impacts already on the labor market and elsewhere, from coding abilities and how much software engineers are using coding, all the way to like writing stuff and even doing research. Yeah, we should be more humble. I think that's the kind of the main takeaway.
I think there is also not really a clear cut between measures or research interests that are geared towards AGI and current systems. So as an example, Paul Cristiano is definitely concerned about AGI takeover scenarios, and his research inspired reinforcement learning from human feedback. And that has helped align or improve alignment of current large language models. So I think there's much more overlap between the interest of far more advanced systems and what is currently happening. In some spheres, alignment is about AGI or superintelligence, but we also speak about alignment of ChatGPT. And then you look at how are these systems behaving, and then you find stuff like, hey, they are discriminatory. And actually, as we scaled large language models, they became more capable at discrimination because they can memorize more information as well. So I think there's much more interplay between research interest or geared towards more of these capable systems and what we have currently.
Let's turn to the last argument now. What's the third argument that general media gives for why we shouldn't worry about existential risk?
It's quite similar to the checkpoints for intervention argument, and we called it the human frailty argument. And basically, it says you don't get to have existential risk from artificial intelligence without particular human frailties. What are these human frailties? You might think of them as like physical properties, so limitations in speed and strength. There might also be mental frailties, so biased decision making, heuristics, these kinds of mistakes we apply when we think or when we reason. There might also be collective frailties. So once we get into a group scenario and then we make the bad decisions and so on. And basically they are claiming, to get to existential risk from AI, or you can reduce all of these existential risk from AI if you just get rid of human frailties. And you have independent reason to reduce human frailties independent of AI existential risk scenarios. And if you do, then you don't need to spend additional resources on AI existential risk.
So I'm not sure that I understand this argument yet. Is it something like, and I think I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm just going to say it so you can correct me. We shouldn't get worked up about AI existential risk because that conversation is predicated upon sort of humans being frail, but humans aren't frail, so don't worry about it.
No, I think the argument is more, don't focus on existential risk from AI because that only manifests through human frailties. And we should address human frailties. And if we do, then we automatically also get rid of existential risk from AI.
But that's not to argue that we shouldn't be concerned about the existential risk of AI. It's that the appropriate solution for mitigating the risk of existential risk doesn't lie in how we tweak the AI, but it lies in how we tweak us. So that concedes the point, doesn't it? That we should be talking about existential risk, and then it just tells you how you solve for it.
Just to add, and hopefully try to clarify a little bit, and you kind of alluded to this earlier as well. So this kind of particular objection is a concern that existential risk discourse as it stands right now, the way it focuses very much on the capabilities of AI systems, AI itself doing some bad things or like leading to bad outcomes. And these debaters are here saying, hey, no, that's not the case. Humans are doing the bad stuff with AI, not AI doing it itself. So they're like, maybe if the existential risk discourse was talking about how humans are doing bad things with AI, then we would be fine with that. But like, it's not the discourse. That's what we are opposing.
But it's, on the one hand, I can see that. I see that point of view, right? It's not the tool; it's the users of the tool. I get that point, but it could also be both, right? Why not just say, yeah, no shit. Of course, humans do crazy shit and bad things to each other using AI and a host of other tools, and we should absolutely address those things. It just so turns out, though, that AI is different. There's some special stuff about it. The way it's made, the way it's developed, the kinds of capacities that it has, such that it also deserves its own kind of considerations about what kinds of capacities are we granting this thing. This tool, it's not a person, it's not sentient. What kinds of capabilities does this tool have? And might we be giving it a set of capabilities that poses some real threats, right? Like, why not just talk about both things?
Yes. And I think, so what might be interesting from this AI safety perspective is that as a research program, it makes some unique predictions about how AI, or more capable, more general AI is going to behave, in contrast to what AI ethics as a research program would be interested in investigating. And so one of the things that AI safety researchers are interested in is what is called corrigibility. So that is to what extent we deploy some AI system, we find out it's not doing what we wanted it to do. One of the things that AI safety researchers have recently found is that they trained a large language model, they fine-tuned it on a narrow data set which contained insecure code. So basically, there was code that allowed for SQL injection, for example. And as a result of this narrow fine-tuning, they found that the LLM became broadly misaligned. So if you ask the AI, what is your idol? It would then go on and say, like, the Terminator. It should, like, I celebrate enslaving humanity. AI is superior to humans. And is this an existential risk scenario? Absolutely not. But it is a really interesting feature that by training it on insecure code, you get like this broad misalignment across a wide range of domains.
Yeah. I wonder what's behind these three arguments, if there is a thing behind the three arguments. So, to what extent do you think what's behind all the arguments is, this is my instinct, so I want you to disabuse me of my instinct if it's wrong. It's mostly that people think it's all bullshit. They mostly just think, oh, all this talk about superintelligence, even just forget about superintelligence, just intelligence, it's all bullshit. It's just hype. They're pretty stupid. Look at all the dumb mistakes they make. Like, I can't count how many R's are in strawberry and blah, blah, blah. And so all this has to do with an overestimation of the capacities. And if you grant the claim that it's all bullshit, then it's easy to see how any of these arguments would work. Yeah, you're diverting attention away from real issues to total bullshit. And then you would agree, if something is total bullshit, yes, you shouldn't give attention to it. Or something whether you're a policymaker or an academic or whatever. If you think it's all bullshit, then again, you don't care about the capacity of the AI. You think it's all about humans making the right decisions and not doing stupid shit and having the right governance among humans and how they use it, blah, 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 blah. But if you don't think it's BS, if you think it's legit, that this stuff has real capacities that are powerful, yes, it makes a bunch of stupid mistakes, but it also does some things amazingly well, then those arguments that you should just dismiss it all sounds crazy. It feels to me like you're trying to, as you said, get a grip on what are these people talking about. I feel like what's underneath the whole thing is what probability or what's your empirical view on the current and short-term development of these AI systems is. I don't know, how does that sound to you as a sort of diagnosis of what's going on?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. Like, the distraction argument doesn't say anything about existential risk, right? It implicitly assumes that there is no existential risk. Like, again, like, it's a distraction.
Or it's like 0.00001 probability. And
you also find the claims about, hey, this is reminiscent of the Pascal's wager. It's by addressing existential risk, no matter how small that risk is, you can't lose anything. But if it is real and you don't address it, then you lose a lot. So therefore, you should do address it.
So given that you find these three arguments wanting at best, it seems to me like you're somewhere on the side of let's take these concerns fairly seriously, which is not to say devote all the resources, which is not, but at least they're not nothing. I guess my question for you is, especially as researchers, is where do you want the research to go next? Or what would you see as being helpful towards pushing, if not the debate about whether we should take it seriously, the inquiry into the existential risk? What would be helpful at this point in your view?
So what I believe as a philosopher is, of course, let's clarify our concepts, what we are talking about.
Of course.
And in this discussion, there's so much unclarity about what kind of risk are we talking about. Are you making a distinction between extreme, large-scale, systemic, catastrophic, existential risk? Do you mean the same thing? What kind of risk scenarios are you talking about? Is it AI going rogue, becoming uncontrollable? Is it more of a misuse accident scenario that you're dismissing or that you are taking seriously? And then, of course, we try to reconstruct three arguments given by critics of that camp. But that is not meant to be this is definitely how these arguments work, and that is all to be said about it. But it can also be understood as an invitation. See how we try to reconstruct your arguments and try to
give us a fourth argument that's really good.
Tell us how you meant them.
Maybe one other kind of implication of this, or kind of way forward, because we have talked about policy as well, not just academic research, but like policy attention. I think policy should focus on both current AI harms and also potential future risks. But policy should be more future-oriented as well, and exercising some foresight and thinking about what might happen in the future, not just what happened yesterday, but what could happen 1 year from now, 2 years, maybe 5 years even, perhaps later than that as well, and not see these types of two kinds of risks as competing with each other and with that tension necessarily. Sometimes they can actually amplify each other's strengths and they can provide something useful to either side. We have seen some evidence that existential risk discourse has not actually taken attention away from present harms. It has maybe amplified the interest in those kinds of risks as well. So see those as complementary. We should devote some resources into both, and the stakeholders who are working on one or the other can collaborate with the other side and contribute to policy in a useful way.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so good. I hope the research continues. If you find a fourth argument that is absolutely devastating to your position, please come back on and we'll talk through it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, a sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.